Okay, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of our distinguished guests, our speakers, our alumni, our current faculty, staff, and students to what I think will be a wonderful day of celebration of past, present, and future leaders, women leaders in environmental science. I'd like to start by thanking people who were instrumental in making this day happen, just so I don't forget them at the end of the day. First, the Polly Walker Ecology Fund, who's funded by an anonymous donor. Happens to be in our midst, but will remain anonymous. CLF, to Bob, Lawrence, and other members of the team, Meg Burke, Chris Stevens, and Mike Milley. To the Alumni Affairs Office, because we've blended a couple different events today, Josh and his team of Morgan and Jimmy Lou have been instrumental in helping us get this affair together as well. And then from my office, Nicole and Ruth, Nicole's there snapping your pictures as we speak. So we'll immortalize this event. I think we would be remiss in having a day, Women in Environmental Health, without mentioning Anna Bacher, who was certainly a pioneer in environmental health science. She was not only a tireless champion for workers' health and safety, but she's left an incredible legacy here at the school with numerous faculty members who were trained by her, including Ellen and Jackie. First in today's lineup, we're going to have the Polly Walker Lectureship, and it's our pleasure to welcome our speaker today, who's going to talk to us. Yeah, he's going to speak without slides, which is kind of different for us. But he is going to talk to us about his inspiring book about the life, career, and contributions of Rachel Carson and other women environmentalists, and that should be quite interesting and inspiring for a whole generation of women scientists. The lecture will be followed by a luncheon where we'll have a chance to talk more personally with Dr. Musil and to sign books while we're having lunch. Right. And after lunch, we are going to have a star-studded lineup of outstanding women alumni in environmental sciences. Some that are still with us here at the school, and others who have gone on to great things, particularly Lynn Goldman, who's now the Dean of Public Health at GW. So we like to tout our successes in training people to go out and populate other schools. So these women represent several generations of environmental scientists, some that have just recently received their degrees, and others that have been quite successful and are senior leaders in the field. Unfortunately, because of the time, we can't have all our distinguished alumni speak today, but many of them are here, and hopefully you'll have a chance to talk to them during the course of the day. So last but not least, I want to acknowledge Bob Lawrence for his outstanding leadership of the CLF and for his tremendous, gentle, very thoughtful, way of dealing with all issues, and it's a pleasure not only to have him as the leadership of CLF, but in all the other activities of the department. And he has announced his intention to step down, much to our chagrin, and he is irreplaceable, and we were quite sad to hear that he will not be with us full time, but we know he's going to be here as much as we can grab him away from Maine. So hopefully he'll be here for quite some time. So I look forward to today's events and know that the legacy of past leaders has positioned us very well to meet what I think are some of the major challenges in the world today, and that's the health of our planet. And hopefully we'll be able to continue to make progress in improving that and public health. So I'll turn the podium over to Bob to introduce today's speaker. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Marcia, and especially those kind words. I was fortunate in having among my mentors the late Julius Richmond, who was Surgeon General during the Carter administration and Assistant Secretary for Health, and one of my close colleagues at the Harvard Medical School when I was growing up. And he once observed that nothing succeeds quite like one's successor. So, Marcia, I plan to be around enough to watch my successor do really great things with the CLF. So, thank you. Just a couple of words today. We're really pleased. This is one of 2 environmental health sciences grand rounds during the year that will be sponsored and supported by the Center for a Livable Future. The next one will be in May when Dick Jackson from UCLA will come and talk about the built environment and its impact on public health. Just 2 quick words about the Polly Walker Ecology Fund. Polly is sitting here in the second row. I think you all know Polly, although she did leave us for Providence about 7 or 8 years ago. 9, 8. But has been very active cyber commuting and working with us, continues to be active in the course we teach in the second term. Polly, as many of you know, trained as a pediatrician. She was in Al Sommer's class at Harvard Medical School and moved to Baltimore, then left clinical pediatrics to raise her 3 children. And when the youngest was finally launched, she began to look for employment, full-time employment. During that time that she was raising her children, however, she was a real force in the environmental movement in Greater Baltimore, working with a number of people who were dedicated to protecting open space, green space, to protecting the quality of air and water and so forth. And so her affiliation and interest in the things that were going on at the School of Public Health was a very natural one. She came to seek counsel from Carl Taylor, and Carl knew that the newly established Center for a Livable Future still did not have a full-time staff member, and Polly came to talk to me, and I hired her on the spot. And she was the driving force for so much that we accomplished. So, Polly, we're really delighted to have you back. And when our anonymous donor was kind enough to support some of the work of the CLF, we thought that establishing a fund in Polly's honor and devoting it to broader ecologic questions, not just the food system, which is the main thrust of the CLF. This has allowed us to do a number of interesting things, including bringing Bob Musil to us today to talk about his latest book. Now, Bob was here as a part-time MPH student, and I had the opportunity to work with him as a faculty member. When he was here as a part-time MPH student, Bob was executive director of Physicians for Social Responsibility, and I'd been paying my dues regularly to that organization for a number of years. So I thought it was only fair play that I was now soaking him with the Hopkins tuition. But he did very well as a part-time MPH student, returned to PSR, and ended up being the longest serving executive director of that organization, which, as the U.S. counterpart of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 96, what year? 1985. 85. And for those of you who are not familiar with PSR, with the resolution of the Cold War and some of the nuclear threat diminishing, although definitely not gone, it broadened its scope to include concern about environmental protection, and continues to do great work in that area. Bob went to Yale for his undergraduate studies, has a PhD from Northwestern, And of course, the MPH from, the most distinguished of his 3 degrees is that MPH from the Bloomberg School of Public Health. Bob's first book, The Hope for a Heated Planet, How Americans Are Fighting Global Warming and Building a Better Future, came out, actually not your first book, that was yours, was that your first book? In 2009. A very, very sobering account of what's happening with regard to global climate change, and eminently worth reading. He's now at the American University as an adjunct professor, and he has just recently been appointed the president of the Rachel Carson Society, which is totally serendipitous. We had no idea this was happening when we arranged for Bob to come and talk about his new book, but it is a perfect fit. Bob's done a lot of other things with radio and basically science translation for the public. He's on the board of directors for the Council for a Livable World and a senior fellow at the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies, in addition to being the adjunct professor at American University. So it's wonderful to have you back, Bob, as a distinguished alumnus of our school, and to talk about somebody who has meant so much to the environmental movement. And I guess, you want to leave that on, or, okay.
I was going to. Oh. Thank you so much, Bob. There's so many thank yous and hellos that I'm afraid I would miss almost everyone in the audience, but surely I am honored to be doing a Polly Walker ecology lecture and looking at our visitor from Providence. And we had a wonderful dinner last night, and I got to talk with many of you. I realize our time is limited, so I want to keep rolling along, but Bob, I want to thank you, but you should be aware that I am suffering right now from student anxiety. I see some, did I finish that paper? I see several of you in the audience who had me as a student. This is actually where the exact spot where I delivered my master's project final delivery. I seem to have passed, but Jonathan Patz was the supervisor of my master's project, which was on global climate change in the state of Maryland. Physicians for Social Responsibility had been doing state-by-state analyses, and frankly, my staff had been doing them. And so I thought it was time for the old man to step up and see what the younger good staff were doing. And so I did an analysis of the state of Maryland and the effects, and this is in 2001. And that was already, there was obviously a lot going on about climate change. So if I seem to be nervous and my knees knocking, it is because there are many of you in this audience who not only know more about environmental health than I do, but also knew the people that I write about in the book. When I wrote this, I had no idea. I talked to Bob Lawrence, and he said, well, this would be lovely. I studied with Harriet Hardy at Harvard. And I went, oh my God, I never even met the woman. And then he said, of course, it would be lovely if you came and spoke, because you have Anna Bacher in your book. And last night, how many of you did I meet who actually know and studied and worked, 4 of you, with Anna Bacher? So I'm going to claim that author's privilege, that all of the errors in the book are mine. And if you really want to know some more, there are people throughout the audience who can help you. I want to explain very briefly, I think. People say, how did you get inspired with the book? And how did this come to be? And now why are you at the Rachel Carson Council? So I think one of the first things I want you to remember about Rachel Carson is that this is a picture of her atop the mountain, on the mountaintop. This is Hawk Mountain, for those of you who are birders. And had this picture been taken, not much more than a decade before, it would have shown men with guns slaughtering the hawks and eagles that came across Hawk Mountain. And there are pictures of, just horrid pictures of these guys with, the long mustaches and the guns, holding red-tailed hawks in strings by their feet, that sort of thing. And it was a woman, Rosalie Edge, who actually organized and prevented and took over the sanctuary. I made it a sanctuary so that Rachel Carson is looking through her binoculars and not shooting all of these raptors, but is welcoming them. But she also was not alone on top of the mountain. And if there's any theme that I hope to elaborate about the book, is precisely to avoid the great man, certainly, theory of history, and even the great woman theory of history. Rachel Carson, for those of you who may not know enough about Rachel, let me just explain it, because I do talk to a lot of undergraduates. They do not know who Rachel Carson is, nor have they read Silent Spring, and so I have to occasionally recap. But I think in understanding Silent Spring, you should be aware that as she wrote about pesticides and the effects on birds, and many people remember that, oh, it was about the robins and the robins dying. And there were people, literally, her friends and colleagues around the country were studying the death of robins. They were outraged. They would find them all curled up on the lawn. And many of you recall that eagles and osprey and others were unable to reproduce because DDT was thinning the eggshells, and so reproduction was being threatened. This was going on all over the land, and of course it was a result of DDT and other pesticides which were being sprayed wildly across the nation. I actually chased a DDT truck on Long Island. They sprayed everywhere. They sprayed for gypsy moths, they sprayed for fire ants, they sprayed for mosquitoes, and then just sprayed for the hell of it. Because during the war, World War II, for those of you who think of the war as perhaps Afghanistan, but in World War II, this was a miracle chemical that saved troops' lives. Marines in the South Pacific, GIs in Italy, citizens, we sprayed, and it did away or prevented outbreaks of malaria and typhus in Italy. It was a wonder chemical, but already by 1945, studies were coming out from Patuxent and that Rachel Carson was aware of, and she actually proposed an article, because she was freelancing, to Reader's Digest in 1945, based on material and studies by our government at Patuxent and elsewhere that there were health effects for humans from DDT. And of course, you might guess that Reader's Digest said, boring, depressing, no thank you, we don't want an article on on pesticides in 1945. It took until 1962 with the publication of Silent Spring and the birth and outrage of a movement concerned, the Committee for Mass Poisoning, against mass poisoning, was started, of course, by women who were very close to Rachel Carson. That included, were one of her closest friends and advisors, an early organizer on this named Marjorie Spock. Again, those of you who are more mature in the audience may realize that Marjorie is the sister of Dr. Benjamin Spock, noted anti-draft, anti-war, anti-nuclear, and also the most popular pediatrician of that era. And Marjorie had a committed life partner named Polly Richards. They had a very nice place on the North Shore of Long Island. They had several acres of organic gardens that were just sprayed by the planes that came. They didn't care what was down there. And I grew up right near there. And of course, she was outraged and brought suit and organized some of the never spray the property of wealthy people. I know, we could have the lecture on environmental justice, but that was a big mistake. And she organized wealthy people on Long Island, and they began the lawsuits that led to all of the things that we take for granted, perhaps the Environmental Defense Fund, the outrage over spraying, and that kind of response is what made the opening that Rachel Carson could have the ability to have someone finally want to do a book on the subject. She approached a number of publishers and finally was able to do that. But I think it should be clear, and it's a theme throughout the book, that Rachel was not alone. She was connected to a whole series of intimate friends, women, and supporters like Marjorie Spock, like Marie Rodell, her literary agent, who was also the literary agent for a young Baptist preacher whose first book, Stride Toward Freedom, Martin Luther King Jr., was handled by Rachel's agent. I believe it's why Rachel Carson has an FBI file, as did Martin and all of the people working with him, thanks to J. Edgar Hoover. But main point on the slide, it is not just a single woman writing one book that launched a movement that created the environmental and environmental health networks and movements that we have. She was supported by women close to her. She was able to take advantage of the growing outrage that was organized by women who brought suit, who wrote to newspapers, who created the Committee Against Mass Poisoning. So Rachel was not alone. The other thing I want you to remember that she was not alone is, I mentioned this is Hawk Mountain. How many of you have been birding and watched the raptors come across? You can admit it, you're not going to get beaten up. For a guy, I don't say that I'm a bird watcher. You know what would happen, right? But, from those ruffians on the playground. But the truth is, not only is she not alone on the mountaintop, this picture was taken by her closest friend and ally, Shirley Briggs, who ran the Rachel Carson Council after Rachel died of breast cancer. Her closest friends created the Rachel Carson Council, then known as the Rachel Carson Living Environmental Trust. Shirley Briggs, who took this photo, wrote her own important book on pesticides, carried forward that work, and led up till today, where I somehow, while being in touch with the Rachel Carson Council, they were searching for a new head. They had a long-time head named Dr. Diana Post, who had been there many, many years. She had retired. They had not found an adequate replacement. And I, of course, wanted to use the photo that they own. I wanted to have a book event and sell my book at the house. And then I discovered, through this strange set of planetary conjunctions, that they wanted someone who would help lead the Rachel Carson Council once again. And since I am available at senior rates, because I have a very worthy successor, Bob, at Physician for Social Responsibility. There was a woman before me and a woman after me. I had this very long time where PSR looked male-dominated, so I have, as a senior citizen, re-engaged with many organizations, with the Rachel Carson Council, but I want you to know that the chairman of the board of the Rachel Carson Council is Rachel Carson's grandnephew and adoptive son, a guy named Roger Christie. Rachel not only took care of her mother all the way through her aged life, her niece had died, the husband had already run off, and Rachel took care and charge of a 5-year-old boy named Roger, who in his youth evidently was a little bit troubling and troubled, and she took him out into nature, and up in Maine they would go and look at the tidal pools or search for owls at night, and opening up Roger to the wonders and glories and mysteries of nature that would help you be in touch with your ability to have awe and imagination and wonder. And that was one of the key critical qualities that Rachel Carson thought was absolutely essential for us scientists, that science alone was not enough, that feeling this sense of awe and wonder was critical. And so Roger is now the chairman of the board, and if he could be here, he lives in Massachusetts and Maine, where Rachel did in Maine. I'm always afraid he will show up and say, "I, sir, knew Rachel, and you are not she." How I came to do this, I do not know. But I know that I I'm following in the footsteps of distinguished women of science, of imagination, of wonder, of writing, of caring for all creation without distinction, because one of Rachel's main themes was the problem with human hubris. If you take a look at Silent Spring, you will see it is dedicated, and she quotes Albert Schweitzer, the great humanitarian doctor, who wouldn't, when I was a boy, a little roughneck, we would joke, "Oh, you're just like Albert Schweitzer, you wouldn't even step on a bug," you know. Well, I don't think he would, and there was a reason for that, the interconnection between these species. If I've said that Rachel was not alone, if Silent Spring did help to make visible and kick off a new environmental movement or a phase of it, she certainly was very, very proud of her education at Hopkins. And I'm not just saying this. She wanted people to know that she was a trained scientist, that she had studied genetics. She was working on her PhD in biology. And sometimes you will hear that Rachel Carson, when she was attacked at the time, and to this day, they'll say, sloppy science, didn't even have a PhD, hysterical woman, spinster. Oh, I mean, it gets worse than that. But the reason Rachel did not finish her degree is, simply put, she was caring and paying for her entire family. They were a poor family. Her fellowship was not enough. She had a full fellowship, but it was not enough to carry all her expenses. And so picture Rachel Carson studying for a PhD while she had 2 adjunct professor jobs, teaching undergraduate biology at Hopkins on the Homewood campus and at the University of Maryland College of Dentistry and Pharmacy, while she was the research assistant to one of the most famous biologists of the time, Raymond Pearl, right here at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. She didn't have the money. She was run ragged. There was no hope of her getting a job probably when she graduated anyhow. And so, like many women, with the family responsibilities, the lack of money, and the depression at the time, through other women friends, she got a job at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where she wrote brochures for the government. They were wonderful, by the way, masterpieces. They still talk about them there. But we're now here at Hopkins. So I want you to imagine Rachel Carson commuting wildly back and forth between the College of Pharmacy and the undergraduate campus and working for Raymond Pearl, whose wife, Maud DeWitt Pearl, does not get enough attention, in my view. And I suspect none of you are old enough to have worked with Maud DeWitt Pearl. Am I on safe ground there? Rachel came to Hopkins in 1929. The Depression had just started, and she was trying to complete her studies during the depths of the Depression. Raymond Pearl was a noted geneticist. He was interested in many things. He was also a eugenicist, and he was the first noted eugenicist to break with the theories, essentially, of racial superiority, and wrote a book in 1927 saying this whole stuff about we need to breed and to get a better breed of human being is racist hogwash. He worked with the NAACP, as did his wife, who edited Human Biology, produced here. The two of them were deeply involved in a whole range of public health, biological, political, social issues of a quite progressive sort. And Maud wrote for popular magazines like Scientific American. And I think, I have to believe that while working with this couple, that Rachel expanded her horizons incredibly, politically, in terms of public health, and the need to reach out. If you're going to discredit racist theories of eugenics, you're going to have some popular literature as well, and a popular book, as well as scientific studies. If you're going to talk about some of the causes of cancer, early articles by Maud DeWitt Pearl in Scientific American and elsewhere. I'm quite convinced. I cannot prove what the exact influence of Maud was on Rachel Carson, but I know that it must have been quite substantial. I want to connect up, so there's your third slide. Women who were supportive and were groundbreaking, who helped Rachel Carson, and that includes Maud DeWitt Pearl. But I want to make another interesting, to me, link that I mentioned that when Bob Lawrence first, he and I talked and invited me over here and then said, oh, this will be great. I studied with Harriet Hardy. That's at that other place called Harvard. But as it turns out, I don't know if many of you know that Harriet Hardy is another product of Johns Hopkins. And Bob, you may or may, you do know, I told you I'd be nervous. Harriet Hardy was an amazing woman who is a colleague of Dr. Alice Hamilton, and we can talk about that in a minute. But I'm sorry, I looked at the wrong note. Hold the video. I wanted to talk, I'm sorry. It was Alice Hamilton who was at Hopkins. Excuse me. Alice Hamilton, how many of you are in occupational and environmental health? You know that she is the mother of all of this, that she went to what she called a second-rate medical school in Pennsylvania, where it was sort of almost a guild. The requirements, evidently, she says in her autobiography, were not that challenging. Then she went to medical school at the University of Michigan. She graduated in 1893. And then she took a residency at Johns Hopkins. So she was here for a year. And so though Harvard likes to claim Alice Hamilton, she is another product of Johns Hopkins. And I think to this audience, her story is well known. But for me, what's important about Alice Hamilton is obviously she went and worked at Hull House with Jane Addams in the settlement in Chicago. She lived in the neighborhoods with poor people. She was so open and warm, and as a woman, able to be not threatening and go into the homes of all of these workers and their families and get to know them, because the epidemiology she had to do in beginning to trace the effects of lead and mercury and other toxins, she had to do it all. It was sort of shoe leather community epidemiology. And she would go look at a place where they were painting bathtubs with enamel. And the residents would say, they've just shown you the place where that's not the problem. It's the other factory across town where they have the dust from the enamel that is burned onto the bathtub that's causing the problem. And so as I got involved with epidemiological studies along the US-Mexico border and elsewhere, I thought I was being very cool and discovering community epidemiology, where literally people on the border, as you know, would say, oh, they say they cleaned up that lead from the battery factory. They piled the dirt over there behind the factory. Come, I will show you where it is. They brought in the experts, but that's where it is. And that kind of involvement with the people on the ground is something that, for me, Alice Hamilton was absolutely critical in our understanding that if you're going to do environmental health studies, you can't just fly in as an expert or be parachuted onto the Mexico border and say, I know plenty and I'm going to help you. It really mattered that she was able to be involved with the community and the workers and find out the realities, because time and time again, people would show her a factory all cleaned up. And then she would find a woman who would say, they told us you were coming and they've cleaned up the whole place. You got to go look at the one that didn't clean up over there. And then she was able to expose all of this. So Alice Hamilton was clearly a foremother of us all, of Rachel Carson and others. But she had a protege named Harriet Hardy, who Bob studied with. and we'll fill in additional information at lunch. But I think the important thing for me about Harriet was her ability to communicate, to write, to be concerned about interdisciplinary studies, because keep in mind that I have a background in English and American studies. I think it's part of what I like about Rachel Carson. She was an English major first, and then she switched to biology. And Harriet spoke often about the need for scientists and physicians to be steeped in great literature and philosophy, to have the imagination, the ability to communicate and think about these subjects in ways that would open up the subject beyond just the hard science, which of course she was quite good at. She also, for you younger women, should, I think, be aware that this is so incredibly groundbreaking. She taught at Radcliffe College. She was also at the Northfield School for Girls. So picture back in the day where Harriet Hardy spoke openly and counseled and taught young women at prep school and college about rape culture, about the dangers of venereal disease, with sex education. It was sort of, and then wrote about it. It was sort of like Our Bodies, Ourselves, which was a feminist book from when I was a little bit younger. This was quite extraordinary. And that's in my view, the ability to confront the serious problems that we have as a woman leader. She had met Alice Hamilton briefly when she was at Wellesley. Alice Hamilton came and spoke, and that's how Alice Hamilton knew Harriet Harder. And she, years later, said, I want you to help me co-author, I believe it was the 4th edition of her Industrial Toxicology. Alice Hamilton had written a whole series of books, and so Harriet Hardy said, oh no, I'm not qualified, I couldn't do that, you're the great Alice Hamilton. And according to the story, they were driving along, and Harriet was driving, and Alice Hamilton just turned her one deaf ear and totally ignores it. Can't hear you, can't hear you. And then people said to Harriet, you have to work with Alice Hamilton, you have to do this. And her work on toxicology, there's a whole history of toxicology books, but I'm also quite aware that Rachel Carson would have known about Harriet and Alice Hamilton. I know she quotes Oliver Cope from Harvard, who was a friend and colleague, and so I can't show directly that Rachel Carson picked up the toxicology textbooks from Harriet Hardy and Alice Hamilton. She's right in line with them. And Harriet also was involved in many sort of wonderful things. But let me move, because I'm a little conscious of the time here, to Anna Bacher, because I had this wonderful dinner last night in the Anna Bacher room. I had never seen the portrait for real. I've seen many photos of it. And what I want you to know about Anna Bacher is, first of all, a story that you've probably heard many times, but it resonated with me. As you know, Anna Bacher would take her students to examine out in the field, factories, go to Fells Point. She was involved in studies of chrome and its carcinogenic properties. She helped clean up chrome factories here in Baltimore. And as she did this well into advanced age, there is a story that a young graduate student taking her course, while I believe she was in her 80s, was huffing and puffing to keep up with her as she evidently, and you will have to tell me, just ran around as the way I imagine it. And he said, oh, golly, Dr. Bacher, I sure hope I'm in your shape when I'm your age. And with a little bit of wry humor, she said, well, I don't know how that could be. You're not in my shape now. Well, that resonated with me for reasons I won't go into. But I think it's important to know, as I'm sure you do, that Anna Bacher, her studies on Chrome and cancer, her work with women in industry, her publications growing out of her work with the U.S. Army, that foresaw flex time, that foresaw a whole series of needs for women in industry, were quite revolutionary. But I also believe, and there may be someone here who has the archives that I have not looked at, but Anna Bacher came to Hopkins just 5 years before Rachel Carson was here, working for Raymond and Maud DeWitt Pearl, and had to have known this young assistant professor who was just a dynamo and popular and all over the place. I have not been able to prove it, but I am pretty certain that part of the atmosphere at Hopkins at the time that would have been fairly welcoming to Rachel Carson was because they were the very first young assistant professors that she would have run into. Now, as it turns out, you may also know that Anna Bacher, when offered her first position by William Howells, then the dean, so, well, you're now going to be an assistant professor, but only if you promise not to marry. We have moved a little bit forward from those days. In fact, we've moved so much forward that I would just want to say a word that I am feeling very, very privileged to be here. But also I see friends, I see colleagues out in the audience, that I wrote in the book, available at lunch, about 100 years of women before Rachel Carson, and 50 years afterwards. And I focused only on women who were scientifically trained, who had written books that were critically acclaimed or sold well or reached a broad audience, and who were advocates and activists, as Rachel Carson was when she worked with the Kennedy administration and Stuart Udall and the rest. And so that includes Sandra Steingraber, who does wonderful books that interpret environmental health through a personal lens because she had an unusual case of bladder cancer at 20 and wanted to know why that is. And she was already a published poet before she got her PhD in biology from Michigan. And so her first book, Looking Downstream, a cancer survivor, an ecologist and cancer survivor, looking at cancer in the environment, traces the growth of industry around her home in central Illinois, in Pekin and Peoria, Illinois, as Caterpillar and other factories began to move in. She tried to trace the chemical exposure. She tried to see where cancer incidence was. And she talked about her cancer in a way that Rachel Carson would not, because we only whispered cancer in those days. But Sandra, being a woman of the 70s, was bolder. And she and Deborah Davis, who is another product of Hopkins and is chapter 6 in my book, both tell similar stories of going to militant women's breast cancer marches near Harvard. I can't figure out if they were the same one, but evidently women went around waving copies of Silent Spring, carrying placards that said, "Remember Rachel Carson. Silent Spring was right." And those actions of taking all of the science, of bringing it to the public, of even taking militant action in the streets, is what led people to start to pay attention. It got the attention of Bella Abzug, some of you will recall, And she called up Deborah Davis and said, this is Bella. I want you to come to some testimony that I'm having. I want to know why when I was at Hunter College, only 1 in 20 women got cancer from breast cancer. And now it's 1 in 9, 1 in 8 on Long Island. And that series of hearings with a strong feminist congresswoman like Bella Abzug came from the work of women scientists who also were deeply engaged in activism and action that created the space for all of us, of course, to do careful epidemiological studies, to look at the hard science, and that's what Rachel Carson also did. But she also took action and was deeply involved in politics. And so as we move to this afternoon's panel, I am sorry I won't be able to stay, but there are many women in this room. Ellen Silbergeld, for example. I was at a seminar or at a retreat where I had to learn this stuff because I came out of the humanities. And Ellen may remember that she was in this incredible argument with Deborah Davis over, to me, some incredibly obscure but important piece of environmental health. And I thought, I'm leading PSR, and these women are like talking above my head, and they know what's going on, and they're making such a difference that I have to go to school and learn more about this. The same thing was true with Lynn Goldman, who's going to be your closer. Lynn was on my board of directors at Physicians for Social Responsibility. We worked very, very closely with the EPA, with politics, with trying to move policy. And if I was inspired by savvy, scientific, pushy women who could make things happen and who knew a hell of a lot more than I did, it was women like Deborah and Ellen and Lynn Goldman who inspired me. It was not just Rachel Carson or Edith or Alice Hamilton or Harriet Hardy or Anna Bacher, though I discovered that they were the shoulders, the giants on which we stood. But it was the women that I worked with who were making a difference, who led me to this room to take toxicology institutes from Jim Yeager, to work on air pollution with Tom Burke, to study with Bob Lawrence, whose courses pulled together the science, the communications, the ability to work on these things that have created the Center for a Livable Future. And closing note, Bob knows this. He knows everything, and he will not be replaced easily. But the Center for a Livable Future also is direct descendant of Rachel Carson here at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. I don't know how many of you know that she was not only interested in pesticides, she was not only wildly anti-nuclear and opposed to open-air nuclear testing from 1946 onward, when she saw the effects of the Bikini Atoll tests in Operation Crossroads, where we blew up an atomic bomb under surplus Navy ships, dropped one from a B-29. We had squealing pigs testing what were the effects. Of course, sailors were exposed. And she and Roger Revelle, the oceanographer who later worked with Al Gore on global climate change, were aware of and opposed to those tests because they saw what they did. And so Rachel Carson was interested. Pesticides, chemicals, nuclear weapons, nuclear waste, and animal industry farming, animal welfare, animal rights. It took more courage in those days. People advised her not to write the foreword to Ruth Harrison's book in England that exposed what we colloquially call factory farming, and that Rachel Carson would have been right here in this room at CLF with you and me and all of us saying, we are not alone. All of these issues, the animals, the birds, the people, are connected. We have to get over this human hubris that we can control the planet and our technologies without regard for the health of the planet and these other species, that Albert Schweitzer was right, that we need to be engaged. And she also would have said, I am not alone. I stand on the shoulders of giants, and I want to work alongside each of you as I do. I am thrilled to be frankly called back to duty with the Rachel Carson Council and back to Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. Because this is the degree of which I am most proud. And it is what has led me and kept me going. And hopefully, like Dr. Lawrence, we will keep up with Alice Hamilton, who went to 101 years old. And so a man has to have goals, and they're usually set by women. And so thank you. And I want to come buy the book afterwards. And Thank you, Tom.
Thanks very much, Bob. It is wonderful to have that historical record of the way in which women, past and present, have done so much to lead the way with regard to protecting the environment. Now, questions for Bob? Yes?
Thank you. Hold on.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you, Marcia. We need to use the mic because it's being recorded and projected.
A point that I really appreciated was about how science alone is not enough and that we need a sense of awe and wonder. And those are elements that a lot of people take from things like spirituality and religion.
Yes.
So, which is often also placed at odds with science. So I'm wondering if you could address the role of religion in this movement.
Are we allowed to talk about religion in a scientific? No, I'm just kidding. I would love to. First of all, in this wonderful book, I'm sorry, I have to, I don't have a commercial publisher. I need you to buy the book. You will discover, excuse me, that Rachel Carson comes out of a tradition of what's called the nature study movement in this country, which, as science began to undermine the inerrancy of the Bible, and so that certain fundamentalist views that the Bible's absolutely right began to be replaced, a whole series of people began to look to nature as one important way of understanding and having access to God, to transcendence, and the like. Rachel's grandfather was a Presbyterian minister, quite learned, and his daughter, Rachel's mother, was an educated woman who had to give up teaching because the minute you married in those days, you had to quit. And so she poured all of her love of nature, her own incredible elite education for a woman at the time, and this sense, it wasn't just pure awe and wonder, it was a sense of being in touch with the divine, and this was interpreted in the early 20th century. Obviously, Rachel was quite knowledgeable in genetics and evolution and the like, but the access to something beyond us, something transcendent, is a very clear lineage there. And I'll stop with that other than to say I have a chapter in a forthcoming book about religion and global climate change. I taught at Wesley Theological Seminary on religious responses to global warming. And I think it's fair to say that people don't understand how broad and serious a religious response there is to contemporary issues in the environment. So but awe and wonder was interpreted. Rachel had her funeral at a Unitarian Universalist church in Washington. She was rather progressive in her views in terms of religion. She wouldn't classify herself as religious, but that's where it came from, and that's what gave her this, I think, this incredible sense of awe.
Yes. Hang on for the mic. Oh, Mark.
I just learned, I think the name of the book is Founding Partners, that among the founding fathers, James Madison was actually a predecessor to Thoreau, John Muir, and Rachel Carson. He wrote a pamphlet that he took very seriously and had a fairly large following. I think it died out. So I'm wondering about Dolly Madison. I believe they had a good marriage. And I guess the only way it might be traceable would be through letters. But I would imagine he talked to her.
I don't know, but no, you paid for the mic, but I have the mic, so I would just want to say, I didn't get into some of the foremothers on the nature side of Rachel Carson, but you mentioned John Muir, et cetera. I love to taunt undergraduates. I won't do it with the professionals and postdocs and everything in this room. But I do my Ferris Bueller bit, and I say, anyone who was the first popular nature writer, who was successful in the 19th century, and they'll, after, you don't remember Ferris Bueller's Day Off? No, you were in laboratories. Anyhow, they think it was Henry David Thoreau. It was Susan Fenimore Cooper. Suffice to say that she published Rural Hours 4 years before Walden. Thoreau quoted her as an expert on ornithology. She wrote about small-town rural life. She has ecological descriptions, scientific and literary, and it was a big bestseller in this country and in England. It sold out and turned into a fine edition within 6 weeks. She was also wrote a popular novel. And toward the end of her life, Susan Fenimore Cooper, who's the dutiful daughter of James, not wife or mother, wrote a lament for the birds, in which she talked about the decline of bird species and their slaughter by men shooting them for heron and egret feathers. This was at the end of her life. She linked up with the younger women, just starting the Audubon Society and the rest, and wrote in the magazine that Rachel's mother read to her all the time, called St. Nicholas Magazine, and Rachel won her first little literary award at age 11, I believe, in St. Nicholas. And that is where, at the very end of her life, Susan Fenimore Cooper joined with political action, with the campaigns to stop the millinery trade's slaughter of birds. And that created a direct link from our first major nature writer, Susan Fenimore Cooper. But there were, yes, Madison and others, and there's another whole tradition before that. But I want to look at that. We'll go to the archives right after this.
I think we have time for one more before we break for lunch and the book signing. Anybody? I guess you've answered all our questions, Bob.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. We'll adjourn. Those of you who have registered, remember, lunch is where? Anna Bacher Room. How appropriate. And then we'll come back here in 50 minutes, and we will start the afternoon symposium. So thank you very much, Bob.